First of all, I think in this very difficult economic times, you have to prioritize. And I think it's important to look at our short-term issues and our long-term issues and how you invest in the long-term issues, how you create the wealth to create those investments. California's probably, I think the movie, gave you that feeling of, that good feeling, but we're really fortunate because the wealth does exist here in California compared to most other states. But we have some very, very severe short-term problems before we get to the long-term problems. And I'll come back to water in a minute. And certainly, California probably has a greater trough in the economic cycle because we had a greater boom. This economy right now is suffering from the fact that so many people grew their businesses based on artificial wealth. Artificial wealth that came out of the housing market, whether people bought cars, whether they bought HD TVs, the retail, the manufacturing, the ports sector expanded because of consumer spending that was created by artificial wealth out of the housing industry. And that wealth is gone for right now. So there's going to be some painful times. There's going to be some times where the economy as a whole that grew is going to have to come back to meet the size of normal growth rather than an artificial boom. I think there's a couple of things that we need to look at immediately, we need to deal with immediately. One is to deal with businesses' costs. When I ask what are the #1 issues, and that was one of the first questions, you get it. This is one of the best things about California is each industry has its own specific ideas of what's economic stimulus to them. But the bottom line is it usually comes down to cost in the short term. Can I afford to do business? Can I afford to hire these people? Can I afford to invest in something in the future? And I think there's ways to reduce some costs on businesses in California. But I think we need to certainly look at our housing situation in California that created this bust. And it's obviously prevalent not just in California, in the United States, but obviously there's impacts globally. But I think if we can come back and stabilize the housing market, I analogize it to, maybe many of you don't remember, but a long time ago when I was in school, there was a book called The Peter Principle. Anybody remember that? That was basically about the concept that everybody gets promoted one level above their level of competency. You don't know they're incompetent until you promote them to the next level. And I think the housing market, to some extent, got to that same situation, that people got in 1 or 2 levels above the houses they could truly afford. I think our goal, and this is where I think some people look at this and say government shouldn't have a role in certain aspects. As we saw, the #1 question that created problems here in California is government regulation. I agree. It raises costs on certain things, but in the housing market, in this era today, we need some government action. We need some government action to buy up some of those foreclosed properties that are at the high end and people can't afford those, and move them into the properties that they can afford. And create a mortgage that they can afford. And allow them not to be penalized for walking away from a property they can't afford, as long as it's sufficiently underwritten to put them in a property they can't afford. But somebody's going to have to take that risk on the upper end. And that's right now, I don't think the credit markets will allow for that, and nor should they. So I think there is a role for government there, but there's also a role for government to reduce costs. They could create more flexibility in how you do overtime. They could create more flexibility in how businesses provide meal and rest periods so you don't have to have extra workforce. There are things that the government can do in the short term if they're responsive and if they look at this strategically. But I think Governor Davis, Bill, everybody makes a good point. The legislature is sort of in gridlock. They're paralyzed.